Hey guys. Hi, I'm Ellen Dykes, and my thesis is on the dangers of expressive individualism, denying the flesh in the age of authenticity. Alexander the Great, the conqueror, the emperor, the man worshipped as a god. His influence, his military skill and power, and his unshakable confidence set him up to live a life of honor, glory, and luxury. What more could one ask for? Alexander was living the dream. But behind this golden facade, there lay an expansive emptiness that Alexander longed to fill. He found his identity, his foundation for his life in himself, in his own power, his own dreams, and his own desires. Many of us have a similar his own powers and dreams and desires. But inside, he knew there was something more he was missing. Many of us have a similar hole inside, an ache in our chests, a longing for something intangible, something seemingly out of reach. Oftentimes, we attempt to fill that hole by doing things that make us feel fulfilled and happy, by expressing ourselves and seeking validation of that expression. But oftentimes we find that that is insufficient to fill the void that we are experiencing. Throughout history, a great divide has been evident over the idea of the proper place of emotions, and in postmodern time, expressive individualism has been widely accepted. Expressive individualism is the idea that people find their true meaning in giving expression to their feelings and desires. The implications of this ideology are far-reaching. When being true to yourself, your feelings and desires becomes the greatest commandment, the failure to be true to yourself becomes the biggest sin, with the rejection of somebody else's self-expression falling close behind. So this means, instead of disobeying God being the most condemning sin, not being yourself is the biggest sin in the postmodern era. But the idea of expressive individualism did not begin in modern times, but began in the Age of Enlightenment. One of the first advocates for the authority of inner feelings was René Descartes, whose ideas can be summarized in the famous line, "I think, therefore I am." Charles Taylor, in his book The Secular Age, explained how this statement links thought and feeling to identity, which leads to the root of expressive individualism, where human thought is given the authority to define identity over material reality. In the 1700s, a Genevan philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, stated that a person's identity is located in the inner psychological life of the individual. He stated that in order to truly and fully know a person, you only needed to have access to their inner desires and feelings, meaning that a person is fully and only defined by these two things. But before this major shift, people found their identity in three things: their country, their family, and their faith. But modern culture has begun to strip away these fundamental tenets of identity. We have lost a sense of national pride, with patriotism being replaced with the feeling of fear of one's own country. The authority of parents have been undermined, specifically by educational systems. And finally, religion, Christianity especially, has been under attack, with fewer and fewer people finding their identity as a child of God. With these things stripped away, people have been left to turn inward to define their own identity. Your identity is based on what you believe is true and important. And truth is now based on feelings, which makes it different for every individual. Many believe that there is no such thing as truth. They tell you that truth is bondage, to believe what seems right to you and to do what feels comfortable. Charles Taylor explains this as the age of authenticity. This age of authenticity is based on Rousseau's belief that in order to be truly authentic, you must act in a way that is consistent with your thoughts and desires, a truth that you define, you decide, and everybody else must accept. But not only individual Christians, but churches as well have been influenced by this shift to expressive individualism. For many people, the religious life or practice that they become a part of must not only be their choice, but it must speak to them. It must make sense to them in terms of their spiritual development as they understand it. This has begun to promote a self-focused gospel, where people are looking inward to discover the truth that they want to hear instead of looking upward towards God, who is the ultimate definer of truth. Almost all aspects of modern culture advocate being true to yourself. But is being true to yourself in reality the noble ideal that modern culture elevates it to be? Or is there a higher nobility in denying the flesh in order to follow Jesus Christ? Christians should not conform to the idea of expressive individualism for three reasons. The nature of man is sinful. Expressive individualism is harmful to society and the church. And because the Bible provides specific guidelines on the proper way we should deal with emotions in a healthy way. So in order to understand authenticity, we must decide what we are being authentic to. Expressive individualism inherently implies authenticity to the nature of self. Being authentic to something is a form of worshiping it, because you set it up as a standard for all of your actions and beliefs. Everything you do is influenced by what you decide to be authentic to. At the root of expressive individualism is a belief that man is inherently good. A common maxim among expressive individualists is that you are perfect just the way you are. Another seemingly contradictory idea is that individuals are fluid and should be honored in their various and changing self-constructions. Together it looks like this. Your preferences are yours and they are allowed to evolve, but however they evolve, you are perfect just the way you are. And this statement might sound actually very appealing, but it is very self-contradictory, yet it is at the core of expressive individualism. But the Bible provides a clearer view of the true nature of man. God created man in a state of perfect innocence, but through disobedience, man fell into a state of condemnation. Ecclesiastes 7:20 says, "Surely there is not a righteous man on this earth, one who does good and never evil." So although we are made in the image of God, man is fallen and inherently sinful. In order to be followers of Christ, we must put aside our fleshly desires. Paul directs us to put to death, therefore, whatever is earthly in us: sexual immorality, impurity, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry. It is essential to note that Paul directly links idolatry with following desires of the flesh. Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him take up his cross and follow him. As Christians, we are called to see our identity not bound up in our desires and our wants, but in our purpose. And that purpose is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. But to glorify him and enjoy him, we must know him and be in relationship with him. And the Bible makes it clear that in order to do that, we must deny the flesh. Whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Sin makes us inauthentic. God created every individual uniquely and individually for a purpose. And being authentic to that purpose is a good thing. But being authentic to our sinful nature and desires leads to destruction, and that is exactly what expressive individualism is. It is a self-centered authenticity versus a God-centered authenticity. We can find our truest authenticity through self-denial. Many would say that self-denial is, in essence, being inauthentic. But as Christians, it is the act of being more authentic to the way God created us to be. If we walk by the Spirit, we will deny the flesh. It is an exchange of darkness for the light found in Jesus Christ. Expressive individualism also is detrimental to society and the church. Over the past couple decades, there have been dramatic increases in the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide in the U.S. In 2023, the percentage of U.S. Americans who reported being diagnosed with depression at one point in their lifetime reached 29%, nearly 10 percentage points higher than 8 years earlier in 2015. But not only the rates of depression have increased, but the rates of suicide as well. A study from the University of Colorado said that beginning in the late 1990s, suicide numbers have been dramatically increasing, with 50,000 people taking their own lives in 2022. Studies have shown a dramatic link between depression and suicidal behavior in social media. In fact, those who use social media are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, leading to a large portion of the population being at risk for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. This begs the question, why is this? Social media is one of the most prominent advocates for self-expression in the modern day. With the rise of social media and influencers, many people's lives revolve around how they portray themselves to the rest of the world, specifically over social media. But we were made to worship something higher than ourselves, not ourselves. The more you revere yourself as the most awesome being in existence, the more awful your life will become. But the more you revere something more awesome than yourself, the more alive you'll become. We were made as humans to worship something higher than ourselves. True and rightly placed awe and admiration leads to the truest form of authenticity. This rise in social media has led to a misplaced worship, where we worship ourselves over God, which has led to a misplaced identity. And this misplaced identity has led to more and more people experiencing anxiety, depression, and ultimately taking their own lives. Expressive individualism also has detrimental ripple effects in the church. For many people, churches have become places of observation and entertainment. Where people once want to be shepherded, guided, corrected, and admonished, they now go to find validation and entertainment. This has led to the rise of attractional churches. Attractional churches are churches that conduct their styles of worship and ministry in a way to attract potential consumers. Not only does this lead to the rise of consumerism in the church, which is harmful in and of itself, but it also leads to the idea of pragmatism creeping into the church. Pragmatism causes people to make decisions based on whatever they believe will give them positive results. And in the church, this looks like a success-driven view of ministry, where success is seen as making churchgoers feel good. Attractional churches have become laser-focused on pleasing the individual, leading to a loss of truly God-centered church services and worship. Paul warns the church about this in 2 Timothy 4:3. He says, "There will come a time when people will no longer endure sound teaching, but will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions." Different styles of worship music and services are not bad in and of themselves, but when the focus is shifted to pleasing the individual, it gives a message that the church's purpose is to entertain people instead of leading them closer to Christ. Expressive individualism also harms community, which is one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity. Community is built on accountability and unity around one common standard of truth. And within expressive individualism, there is no one common standard of truth because truth is based on your feelings. So expressive individualism is a massive source of division. Christianity is built on community, and expressive individualism tears that apart. Expressive individualism places an unhealthy emphasis on emotions and their place in one's life. But the Bible provides specific guidelines on how we should deal with our emotions in a healthy way, specifically in the Psalms. In fact, John Calvin, when he was talking about the Psalms, said, "I've been accustomed to call this book an anatomy of all parts of the soul, for there is not an emotion that is not here represented as in a mirror." David lived a tumultuous life fraught with emotions. Although fear, anger, disappointment, and sadness surround him at times, he refused to let these things overcome his soul and, most importantly, his faith. Instead of succumbing to these things, he laid it down in prayer and lamentation before the Lord. David begins Psalm 69 with the words, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I've come into deep waters and the flood sweeps over me. My tongue is weary from crying out. My throat is parched, and my eyes grow dim with waiting for my God." But even through his lamentation, David turns to take his eyes off himself and turns into the Father in awe and admiration. And this awe and admiration leads to hope. He finishes that very same psalm with the words, "Let heaven and earth praise him, the seas and everything in them." Although David is struggling, he decides to look upward towards God and praise him for how good he is in all situations. In trials and temptations, in the midst of trying emotions, we should use the example of David in surrendering our burdens to the Lord, praying for deliverance, and then finding strength and hope in glorifying his name. David set the example of not looking inward for hope, but looking upward. Expressive individualism tells us to look deep into our hearts, discover our inner essence, and express that to the world. But the gospel shows us that the depths of our hearts are steeped in sin, and what we need most is not expression, but redemption. People often base their faith on their feelings. Many of us have experienced not feeling authentic in our faith, or not experiencing the euphoric feelings that we would expect to experience as a Christian. And sadly, many people walk away from the faith because of this. But we need to understand that faith is not defined by our feelings. The very essence of faith is believing in the absence of seeing, or in this case, feeling. David experiences fears of the absence of the Lord. He says, "How long, O Lord, will you forsake me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" But he refuses to let these doubts overcome his faith. Instead, he overcomes these feelings with truth. True faith is believing whenever believing feels the hardest. As Christians, we are called to strive to be more like Jesus. Galatians 2:20 says that once a person is saved, it is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. But what does being more like Jesus truly mean? Christ is the epitome of self-sacrificial love. He gave up his life so that we could live. The Son of Man came not to be served, but gave himself as a ransom for many. So true authenticity is not a deep love for yourself, but a deep self-sacrificial love for others. What we are worshiping, we're becoming. The more we make our rapidly changing and fluctuating thoughts and feelings and emotions the basis for our identity, the more we become overcome and consumed by these things. But we are called to be imitators of Christ. So let us lay down our wants and desires in order to do that. Some say that emotions do have authority in defining our identity because they are the basis of relationships. But I would argue that love is basis for relationships, not emotion. And many would say that love is an emotion. But Christian love is not merely an emotion, it is a duty. As Christians, we are called to lay ourselves down in self-sacrificial love for others. 1 John 3:16 says, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers." This modern idea of putting yourself first, or self-love, is not truly loving because we're called to lay down our lives for our brothers. Love is an action, not merely a feeling. The Bible calls us to love our enemies. We're called to love in spite of feelings that urge us not to love. Expressive individualism is deeply dangerous to mankind as a whole, and as Christians, we must keep up our guard in order for it to not infiltrate into our communities and churches. We are called to live our lives in submission to God, where we find our true identity, where the old flesh is made new. This modern culture, with its obsession with authenticity, has been swept over with waves of depression and discontentment. But the Bible provides guidelines for how we can deal with emotions in a healthy way. We must collectively choose not to spend our lives looking inward, focusing on ourselves, but looking outward to love others and ultimately looking upward towards God, where our true identity is found. This modern culture has been swept over with a pandemic of unhappiness. Like Alexander the Great, even those who have everything they could ever want are finding themselves empty. It is fabled that Alexander once said, "Empty-handed I came into this world, and empty-handed I shall go. My whole life has been a hollow waste, a futile exercise." So let us examine ourselves and find where we have made our wants, our desires, and our feelings our God, and let us crucify those idols at the feet of Jesus Christ, because those things will never fill us. We must find our identity in the one who holds our lives in his hands.